بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. All right, here we are with the great Imam al-Dīn al-Wāsiṭī rahimahullah ta'ala, Shaykh Shuyukhina. And we're now ready to move on to the next, I would say, transition, if you will, from a life of the Ahmadiyya order. And when I say Ahmadiyya, I mean like the Ahmadiyya Rifa'iyya, not the Ahmadiyya Qadianiyya. That's another Ahmadiyya channel altogether. Yeah, that's the new version. The Qadianis, we're not talking about them. That's a whole nother bag of stuff. So if you've been with us, then you'll know that Imam al-Dīn grew up in the Ahmadiyya community of Wāsiṭ in Iraq, and at some point decides to begin a journey in pursuit of knowledge. And that's what we're going to look at today. And if you have the printout with you, we'll read through this quickly, and then we'll circle back to highlight some of the finer points that we could walk away from after reading the passage. So it says here, he's narrating his own story. He says, "Then I moved from that group," meaning that group al-Ahmadiyya, "to the ranks of the Shāfiʿī jurists to seek knowledge. There I found myself among a people better than the first group. They possessed knowledge of halal and haram, the prescribed limits and legal rulings, what's permissible and what's impermissible, and knowledge of what leads to reward and punishment. Such belief and knowledge amid those darknesses was light and guidance, let alone acting upon it. However, they concern themselves with nothing besides fiqh. Though some also studied usul al-fiqh, or legal theory, and the terminology of Ibn al-Khatib, holding him in the highest esteem, venerating him, acknowledging him to be the greatest Imam and one of the pillars of the religion. Whenever he was mentioned before the Imam, they would say, radiyallahu anhu. Most of what accompanied them was the disputes and legal cases of people. Their hearts were filled with at-tanbih, al-muhadhab, al-wajiz, al-Wāsiṭ, sharh al-wajiz, al-hawi, al-lubab, al-ujab by Abdul Ghaffar, and al-muharrar by al-Rāfiʿī. Among them, there was no knowledge of the foundational sciences of the Sunnah, the sciences of hadith and their principles, the knowledge of its transmitters, or distinguishing its authentic reports from its weak ones. Nor did they possess knowledge of worshipping Allah through the Sunnah, nor did they possess knowledge of the principles of creed as transmitted by the companions and the early Salaf, such as the two Sufyans, the two Hammads, Ibn al-Mubarak, Ahmad, Ishaq, and those like them. Rather, the foundations of their creed were taken from the principles of the mutakallimun, who relied upon reason and speculative inquiry. As for the righteous and scrupulous among them, they refrained from delving into matters of creed. They consigned such matters to what Allah intended, believing in them only in a general sense, without detailed knowledge." He goes on, lamenting the situation. Their natures were dry, and their hearts were devoid of the fragrances of love for Allah, fear of Him, reverence for Him, and longing for Him. No fragrance of servitude or ubudiyyah, sincerity in one's devotion, devotion with pure intention, or eagerness to perform righteous deeds with sound intention and an open heart could be perceived from them. They competed fiercely for leadership and stipends, vying for positions. If someone sat above one of them in rank, it was as though his soul departed from him. If someone was seated above him in rank, That's a repetitive line. It was though as if soul had left him. At times, his resentment would become so overwhelming that even his food and drink became distasteful to him. And at other times, it would lead him to backbite and malign the one preferred over him. They were nothing more than vessels of fiqh, legal rulings, and the disputes of people. Whenever a legal dispute arose, they resolved it by citing what had been transmitted in the books, permitting it without examining the original basis of the issue in the hadith. Rather, once the discussion reached a commentary or the explicit statement of a certain scholar, the matter was settled as far as he was concerned. Despite that, by Allah, I certainly benefited from them by learning what is permissible and what is impermissible. One of the remarkable things I found among them was that some held that earlier group in high regard and continued to visit them despite knowing the deviation of their path. From this, I concluded that they did not possess enough of the Muhammadan light. It's what he calls an-Nur al-Muhammadi, by which the true condition of such people is unveiled. So I remained among them for a time, imprisoned like a bird in a cage, with the only breath of fresh air coming from the books of the Sufis. And then after this, he goes to the Sufis of Baghdad, but we'll get to that another time. So let's dive into this a little bit to take a closer look at some of what we're reading here in this passage. So, of course, if you remember, Imam Wāsiṭī complained greatly about the lack of knowledge in his community, profound lack of knowledge of the Sharia. They did not know halal from haram. They didn't give any emphasis on learning the basics of wudu, etc. They fled from the prayer when they started it. They were quick to leave so that they could go, listen to their songs and dance and things of that nature. And so he left for Baghdad, searching for something. He wasn't just leaving the environment for the sake of relocating for a job. It was, he's going to seek knowledge. And the knowledge that he was after was the sound understanding of the Sharia. So he went to Baghdad. And this is probably like around 670 to 680, around that time, I would imagine, in that ballpark. So during that time, Baghdad was still remained like one of the capitals, if you will, intellectual capitals of the Muslim world, even though this was after the Mongol conquest and invasion, right? The whole place had already been sacked. So that was just prior to his birth. So he grew up post-Mongol invasion, and the people of Baghdad rebuilt much of what was destroyed, tried to recapture what had been lost, if you will, during that time, and the city still flourished to a degree. It hosted many scholars of all the four legal Sunni schools. The Hanbalis, of course, retained historic roots because Baghdad is the city of the great Imam Ahmad and others. Hanafis maintain a significant presence there. The Malikis were represented, smaller in number. And it was here that Imam al-Wāsiṭī encountered the Shāfiʿī jurists. It seems to be at that time the madaris, the various schools and teaching positions, had become dominated by that particular madhab. And they were focused on study of fiqh, usul al-fiqh, and related disciplines. And that's where he says, I found myself among a group far better than the first. So when he moved and was in that scholarly class, he recognized the virtue they had over the community that he grew up in. If we remember Imam al-Wāsiṭī from his teachings, is that even the one who's just a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not seeking to become a great scholar of the law, but is striving to get closer to Allah, they absolutely need the basics of fiqh. They need to know how to make wudu and pray and pay zakat and fast and make hajj. The pillars of their religion. They need to know the legal code when it comes to the things that their life will come in contact with, whether they're in business or trade or whatever they're doing. They need to know that so that they can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accordingly. And they're not jeopardizing their nafs by plunging into the haram, as that would be a barrier between you and your objective, which is ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here he is, and he acknowledges they're far better than the first group. They possess knowledge of what is lawful and what is unlawful, the legal limits and rulings, the hudud, the sharia, permissible and impermissible, what earns reward, what incurs punishment. And he says, in the midst of those darknesses, the darknesses of Wāsiṭ, etc., the knowledge they possessed was a light and a guidance. So here, this statement that he opens up with, of course, is very significant because it shows that Imam al-Wāsiṭī, a great spiritual master, Junaydu asrihi, did not reject fiqh. It was not something that he looked down upon or despised like his community did in Wāsiṭ. Rather, he appreciated being able to leave and study. Very different from his childhood environment. However, as he progresses with this community of scholars and students of knowledge, he becomes convinced that legal knowledge alone is not enough. So one thing we have to remember about the rihla that we're reading through, it's a retrospective critique. He's looking at things at the latter part of his life. So the reflections are very different than in the moment, right? So a lot of times he says, like as we note here, he was felt trapped like a bird in a cage, and the only fresh air that he could get was from the books of the Sufis. And we know the Sufi books that he was reading was Ihya al-Ulumuddin by Imam al-Ghazali. He was reading al-Risal al-Qushayriyah. He was reading Qut al-Qulub. So these were some of the foundational works that he had access to. And within those works, they articulate a very similar approach. Imam al-Ghazali was a great faqih, and he has sections in his Ihya about ibadat and the importance of worship and the inner dimensions of worship. And so he's now getting a first-hand experience of what it looks like moving from Wāsiṭ now into an environment where it's dominated by fuqaha. And he's seeing that when all focus is given to fiqh, it leaves a gap. Whereas in his old community, all focus was given to ahwal, spiritual states and experiences. There were gaps that were left. So he believed that not only did you need legal knowledge, but you also needed to have purification of the heart and a genuine approach to spiritual life. So in Baghdad, this is where like a first major deficiency was being filled for him, beginning to seek knowledge of the law. And it wasn't in any old environment. And this is where we need to take a little pause and kind of dive into this just a little bit, because there's a tremendous amount that can be said about the environment that he went to study. The scholarly culture in Baghdad, especially among the Shāfiʿī jurists, and he points out some of this here. It's worth noting and unpacking a little bit. So, of course, the tremendous benefit that he found, he's describing in a kind of a dual manner. highlighting the concentration that they had, but also the gaps that left. As he said, the people possessed nothing but fiqh. They engaged in fiqh. There are those that engaged in legal theory, usul fiqh, according to the methodology of Ibn al-Khatib. And they held him in the highest regard and esteem, considering him as the greatest imam of one of the pillars of the religion. So here, Imam Wāsiṭī is criticizing something, but it's not a lack of knowledge. He's criticizing legal scholarship in that environment that had become dominated by the study and maybe disputation, study of fiqh, and like disputation of issues that related to the law. And because of that fixation, it left little room for other sciences or other fields of study in Islam. And so that gap could be seen in the formation of the scholarly class as well as the spiritual seekers. Note something he points out. Ibn al-Khatib. Who's that? It's like the way that he says it is important to note. The way he notes Ibn al-Khatib is just said like a household name. Ibn al-Khatib is Fakhruddin al-Rāzī. You've heard of his name before? Most people have heard of his name before. Fakhruddin al-Rāzī, because at the time that was a household name for sure. He was the prominent, of course he had passed away by this time, however, his legacy lived on. He's known as Ibn al-Khatib. And the Shāfiʿī scholarly tradition that Imam al-Wāsiṭī entered in was built around an established curriculum shaped by the leading authorities of the madhab, with Imam al-Razi being considered the most influential figure of that time. So I'm not trying to draw a direct similarity, but because our discussions have been largely around the Hanbali school, it would be like going into the Hanbali area, let's say Damascus, which is where he's going to end up, and Ibn Qudama, for example, being the main name, and the works, because remember he studied al-Kafi by Ibn Qudama when he arrived in Damascus. So that would be a similar like figure within the Hanbali school during that time. Ibn Qudama was recognized as one of the pillars of the madhab, standing next to Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, the grandfather of Shaykh al-Islam. Right? So those two were recognized as the pillars of the school, and their kind of scholarly work and development and legacy was what was now leading the curriculums and the scholarly class. So that's where he's at. If we were to say like something similar to that in Baghdad, he's finding that everything is kind of revolving around Imam Fakhruddin al-Rāzī in a way, and then there's support works that go with that. Imam al-Rāzī, born in 544, passed away in 606, the Hijrah. One of the most celebrated Shāfiʿī scholars of his time. He was educated by his father, and then of course by leading scholars throughout the Eastern Islamic world. He was distinguished in fiqh, in usul fiqh, in kalam, in philosophy, and in tafsir, among other topics. He was prolific in writing. He wrote about almost everything. And he traveled extensively, and his travels brought him throughout the Muslim world, ending up into the courts of powerful rulers he gained patronage, financial support, and through that considerable influence. He also came into money. He was not born into wealth, but from what I understand, there was a doctor who had two sons. Imam Fakhr al-Rāzī had two daughters. The doctor was getting close to the end of his life and married the kids. And when he passed away, Imam Fakhr al-Rāzī came into a lot of wealth, probably through that relationship. And that wealth kind of helped facilitate a lot of his work. Being able to travel, being able to now get the message out there. And that's how it's always worked, right? You need the cheddar. You know what I mean? Yeah. You got to have the cheese, brother. Otherwise, where are we going? What are we doing? Yeah. Yeah, so interesting story. Not only that, but he was recognized and called Shaykh al-Islam in Herat because he was a very profound preacher as well. Not just an author and shaykh and a teacher, but it was also a preacher. Very different roles. Right? The preacher's role is very different than the teacher's role. Right? A preacher gets up there and appeals to people, sometimes even engages people, is not just giving information and details and breaking things down into categories and terminologies. This is more of an appeal to someone's heart. And through his preaching, it said that he was able to help people find their way back to Sunni Islam from different ideas and views. Imam al-Razi's influence, as I said, he was a prolific author, so his influence wasn't based on a single work. Right? There might be one work in which everyone knows and it all kind of comes back to that one work, but his, what we consider a scholarly project, spanned across tafsir. He has a tafsir. It's, from what I understand, incomplete, but it's tremendous in its depth. It's said that his tafsir of Surah al-Fatiha takes one volume. Mujallad. An entire volume. He also wrote in the subjects of Kalām, which is like theology. Different from creed, where you take your belief directly from Qur'an and Sunnah. Kalām is more of a theological approach. Sometimes they say didactic theology or speculative disputation, things of that nature. And we're going to get into that much later as we dive into those topics. But that is one of the areas in which he excelled. Legal theory, usul al-fiqh. He wrote in falsafa, philosophy, medicine. He authored books in grammar, in logic, other disciplines. And his writings, not only because of the breadth of his writings, but the depth of them that began to spread rapidly throughout the Muslim world. It's noted in his biography that his books spread throughout the lands. People devoted themselves to studying them and abandoned many of the earlier works. He was the first to introduce this arrangement in his writings and brought forward methods that had not preceded him. So, revolutionizing, if you will, the study of certain topics. And that happens. Every madhab goes through that process where one phase of it has a work or two or three that rises to the top of the others and becomes the standard of which all refer to. And then someone will come along and will further develop that madhab, expand upon what was already there, build upon it, address new issues that had not been addressed based on principles of that madhab and their imam. And then they will produce something by Allah's grace and favor that will then replace the former works, and that will now become the go-to reference. Like Ibn Qudama and his al-Mughni or his Kafi. That became the standard. Like in the phase of the Mutaakhirun, it became Muntah al-Iradat by Ibn al-Najjar and al-Iqna' by al-Hajjawi. Those books came, and the Hanabila as a group, they recognized these are now the references for our age. So this is what happened with his works. That's why he says people abandoned many of the earlier works. Tajuddin as-Subki, he says his works became famous throughout the land and people occupied themselves with studying them, abandoning the earlier works. Essentially the same thing. The earlier versions of those madhab works were now replaced with Imam Fakhruddin al-Rāzī, Ibn al-Khatib, his work. And so by the time Imam al-Wāsiṭī arrives into Baghdad, Imam al-Razi's legacy, his intellectual legacy, was already established. His writings had become the foundational text within the Shāfiʿī curriculum. And this explains why Imam al-Wāsiṭī mentions him in his Rihla without introducing him. He just says his name like that, Ibn al-Khatib. He doesn't say this man was here and this was da-da-da. He doesn't even say he was a muhaddith, he was a this, that, or the other. Ibn al-Khatib, we know he's talking about fiqh. He's the faqih. He's the one. So that gives you an idea like how famous, legendary he was. Okay? And that's the environment. Tajuddin as-Subki describes Imam al-Razi as the foremost of the mutakallimun, the theologians of his age, and one of the defining intellectual figures of the Shāfi'i tradition. During his lifetime, his lectures attracted hundreds of jurists and students, and his influence continued to grow long after his death. Ibn Khallikan, he's one of the historians, also preserves the two scholarly lineages that shaped his education. So in Usul al-Dīn, or Kalām, his chain of narration, if you will, runs first through his father, Diyauddin Umar, then Abu al-Qasim al-Ansari, then Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, then Abu Ishaq al-Isfarayini, then Abu al-Hasan al-Bahili, and finally Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. So this is the Ash'ari school of the Mutakallimin. And so here you can see that tradition of narration, if you will, passing down until we reached what they would consider the Imam. So this is when it comes to Usul al-Dīn. And then in Shāfi'ī fiqh, his chain likewise passed through his father, then Imam al-Baghawi, then al-Qadi Hussain al-Marwazi, then al-Qaffal al-Marwazi, then Abu Zayd al-Marwazi, then Abu Ishaq al-Marwazi, then Ibn Surayj, then al-Anmāṭī, then al-Muzani, and then ultimately Imam al-Shāfi'ī, rahimahullah ta'ala. So here you can see Imam al-Razi isn't just showing up on the scene and like, I got a new religion, guys. It's Islam, but it's the 2.0. I got the new one, right? But he has a lineage, as a heritage. You can trace his heritage back to these great founders. And then they can go back after that. What's interesting here, and this is like pretty well known, the Shāfi'iyya, a lot of them are Ash'ariyya. This is how, not all of them of course, but a lot of them are. And this is how the tradition of that particular madhab, it moved. Right? You know, there's one chain for the Aqidah and there's one for the fiqh. Hanabila, one. Consolidates things. Yeah. I mean, they were zuhad anyway, right? So why two when you can have just one? It's the zuhad here. Okay? Minimalists. Why do we need two chains when we can have one in fiqh and one in aqidah and one in zuhud. It brings it all there together. Okay? And that's what you would find among the majority of the Hanabila. It doesn't mean that every Hanbali in fiqh is Hanbali in aqidah. Right? You'll find some of them of the Hanabila are following the madhab, the juristic school, and then some of them might be Ash'ari, for example. It's possible. No problem. It doesn't quite make a nice, tight fit, but it does exist. Right? Because of a lot of times, what you'll find when you study aqidah, your doctrine, you'll find an overlap with that and usul al-fiqh. There'll be certain areas in which those things overlap. And so, if you want to make things kind of like singular and clean, that's how the combination is made. Why is it different with the Shāfi'i and Ash'ariyya? Because a Shāfi'iyya, you'll find that many of their books in usul are from the mutakallimun. I'm not saying the Hanbali books or the usul al-fiqh books are also based on that mutakallim framework, but they've been worked in a certain way that they match more with the Hanbali thought process, and I guess you might say like the Hanbali personality. Right? Al-Mizaj, al-Hanbali. Okay? You know the Mizaj? Yeah. The vibes. You got to have the vibes. So it's important to note here, the reason why I mentioned that, it's important to note that Imam Fakhr al-Razi is not just somebody popping on the scene and just like out of nowhere, he's authoring books and he's got no background, he's just like a newbie and everything. No, he's well trained, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obviously gifted him in a profound way. Not only gifted him in terms of his ability to write, but also gifted him with qabul, acceptance. That's another thing that we can't overlook, is there could be many people that could write well or that could contribute, and for one reason or another, it doesn't spread. And that's how you look at the four madhahib. Okay? The four madhahib are with us today, until today. Even though Imam Ahmad passed away in 241, the last of the Imams, we still have these great four madhabs. But there were other madhabs that existed before that. Some of them had more students than the founders of the four madhabs in its early days. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed that these four be the ones that survived and the ones that comprised of the religion of Islam. And the other ones, not that there were anything wrong with them, it's just they didn't stand the test of time. And that's the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah is the one that decrees acceptance and longevity of something. And so Imam Fakhr al-Razi, not only did he receive acceptance during that time and subsequent generations, but his works continue to be sources of reference and inspiration. One example of that, and it goes cross-madhab, by the way. You'll find Imam al-Razi, his influence crosses the madhab lines because he's so profound. And that's something that we should keep in mind. That because you belong to one madhab doesn't mean you're not benefiting from the others. Because ultimately, like all of them were kind of related to each other by one student or direct students. Imam al-Shāfiʿī was the teacher of Imam Ahmad, until eventually Imam al-Shāfiʿī started to benefit from Imam Ahmad when it came to hadith, etc. And you'll find the same thing with Abu Hanifa and his students, Imam Malik, and then between him and Imam al-Shāfiʿī. So there's always some type of link and connection where they're benefiting one from the other or from each other. And so that happens within the madhab as well. That while each madhab has its particulars and distinguishing qualities, there's regular contribution and benefit that's to be had. And one example is Ibn Adil al-Nu'mani al-Hanbali, one of the great Hanbali Imams, Mufassir. Al-Lubab fi Ulum al-Kitab is his tafsir. It's printed, available today. It's quite big, a multi-volume tafsir. We're familiar with Mujiruddin al-Ulaymi and his tafsir, which is what we might consider like lower intermediate. Imam Ibn Adil is a little advanced. Yes, it's quite deep. And he regularly cites Fakhruddin al-Rāzī and his tafsir. Regularly. I mean, long passages too. Because they're tremendous. The benefit is profound. I mean, how would you not be interested when you can write an entire volume on Surah al-Fatiha? You have to think there must be something in there. Yeah. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with reception in mass. And of course, he was celebrated among Shāfiʿīyya and is still celebrated until today. But the view of him is not identical across all the scholarly tradition. There are others that have things to say. Imam al-Dhahabi, for example. Imam al-Dhahabi was a great historian and has many works on scholarly biographies. He wrote Tarikh al-Islam. This is a multi-volume historical work. And when I mean multi-volume, I mean maybe like 70 volumes in print today. Yeah. I think I might have about 50 in my office. I couldn't find the other ones because I was buying from the used bookstore a lot of times. We're trying to say, especially if you're going to buy a book that big, you keep your eye on the used bookstores. Okay, Medina had one used bookstore, and what would happen was people would pass away, right? And like the person that passed away is maybe like the father, and he was a book collector, maybe he was a sheikh, and then the family ended up with all these books, and they got no idea what to do with them except to sell them. So they take them to the bookstore, and they sell the books, and then they're secondhand, so they sell them at a discounted price. So we would stop by at least. Sometimes you'd get on a run like every day on the way home. You'd stop in just to see the new section. And then if you were really smart, you would work with the guy, the bookseller, and you'd be like, hey, you know me, right? So you'd start having to chat him up a bit and start getting friendly and create a relationship over several visits. And then you could say, hey, listen, I'm looking for this, that, or the other. If somebody comes in, I want you to give me a ring first, and I'll be here right away so that it doesn't fly off the shelf. So, yeah, that's just a little inside scoop on how the bookstores work. And, this particular book, I was unable to purchase the other remaining copies, but like I said, and it might not be 70, it might a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. Very tremendous work. Among other works, Imam al-Dhahabi wrote. And Siyar A'lam al-Nubala is a book that he wrote just about scholars, the scholarly class. Multi-generational book. Doesn't matter the madhab. He's going to have an entry on just about everybody of any distinction. Of course, he does have an entry for Imam Fakhruddin al-Rāzī. The entry, it's rather short because the book is not that big. I mean, in comparison to the number of names he's listed. And he says, the great scholar, master of many disciplines. So he begins right away with acknowledging the reality of who he was. A man of extraordinary learning and, of course, widespread influence in his writing. But then he cautions that some of Imam al-Razi's works contain serious departures from the Sunnah. Of course, concluding that he ended his life in a good way. There's a story of Tawbah involved, which is a good sign. Regular Tawbah is important, but there are multiple stories of scholars at the end of their life coming to some final conclusions when the finality of things are felt, and then they want to kind of take a safe route. Maybe they were on the cusp of like thought and pushing boundaries and developing ideas. And then you get to the end, you're like, wait a minute. I just want to pull back everything to like what's absolutely safe, what is totally agreed upon. And that's something worth exploring here. However, that's how he mentions it. He says he basically concludes his life in such a way, and he asks Allah for his pardon. So the idea is not to evaluate Imam al-Razi from like that lens. Where did he depart or where did he not? What we're looking at here in this portion of the Rihla is the influence that his thought had on the scholarly class within Baghdad. And I think maybe a fair and balanced assessment of the great Imām Fakhr before we begin to look at the critique of Imam Wāsiṭī. If you remember, we looked at Imam Ahmad al-Rifā'i. He was the founder of al-Rifā'iyya, al-Ahmadiyya, basically is where that comes from. And we looked a little bit at his life story and noted his praiseworthy qualities and the great imams that had much to say about him in terms of his devoutness and his worship and his connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. So Imam Fakhr al-Razi himself, as we've already highlighted, has tremendous praiseworthy qualities. Not only was he a brilliant scholar and a gifted preacher, he is described, especially in moments of preaching, as not only being eloquent, but being moved to tears and having a very soft side that would be affected by such exhortations and reminders. And so the reason why I mention this is because we have to distinguish between leading scholars and later developments associated with their intellectual legacy. So just like we would not associate the deviant practices that Imam Wāsiṭī observed and lived through, whether it's in the form of worship or interaction with people, okay? You know what I mean? We would not say this is Imam Ahmad al-Rifā'i's teachings because they belong to his order, so they must have picked this up from there. No. That's important to clarify and to make a clear distinction between a founding imam and then later practices that may have crept in. And they even mentioned this in his biography. Practices crept into his order. And so why I'm saying this is because Imam al-Razi, he was an intellectual, but he was also profoundly spiritual at the same time. So what Imam Wāsiṭī notices here in this community is fiqh without spiritual formation. That's how he describes them. They're vessels of fiqh, legal rulings, and people's disputes, nothing more. He says, when a legal case arises, they resolve to it by citing what is found in the books without investigating its foundation in the hadith. Once they reach a commentary or the statement of a recognized authority, the matter ends there. Right, so basically he's saying, look, that's all they did. All they did was fiqh and argumentation, disputation. Sometimes that was considered a form of entertainment. Instead of scrolling, we have, our entertainment is so garbage. Right? The stuff that we're entertained by is so garbage. I mean, not to say that their entertainment was like, there was garbage forms of entertainment, I'm sure, during that time. We just identified some in Wāsiṭ, right? Some of the garbage, there's always garbage entertainment, but sometimes the entertainment was listening to these fiqhi debates, coming up with an issue that doesn't exist in reality to see how a faqih would handle it. What happens if a this and a that, and then they did a this thing, and then on top of that it was wrapped in bacon? What would you do? That kind of a dispute, it doesn't exist in reality. They just want to see. And so they'd watch. They're going to go through thing and like, let's add another potential element to it. And this is what was engaging to people, especially when the ruling class got involved. Now you can get supported financially for doing those types of things. So basically, Imam Wāsiṭī is essentially highlighting that in his critique, fiqh alone is not enough. When it becomes detached from the prophetic tradition, as well as spiritual formation, it leaves a gap. And so he describes how this manifests when he describes their hearts lacking love of Allah, fear of Him, longing for Him, and sincerity in worship. Deficiencies, of course, that Imam Wāsiṭī identifies in other works. So when people get fixated on the outward elements of the Sunnah, and the inner part of it is lost, then they've missed the point. Right? When you build your religion on what's halal and haram, and underneath that is not love of Allah, love of the Prophet ﷺ, it's only a matter of time until your gas tank will run out. Because it can't be purely about personal discipline. Some people, they try and live their life like that, not even in Islam, but outside. It's about me and my discipline. And if I'm disciplined enough, I can achieve, and I can go the distance through discipline. It's like the David Goggins of the world. You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, you don't know me, son.
David Goggins is a discipline guru. Yes.
He's an ultra-marathon runner from Navy SEAL, U.S. military.
There you go. Perfect. So those guys are about discipline. All right? But David Goggins is one of one. There's one of him. Right? The majority of people don't go the distance on discipline alone. Otherwise, we'd see a bunch of David Goggins running around because there's a lot of followers. They aspire to be like him, except for one reason or another that the discipline that he has is just not in them. Right? Coming back to relying upon myself and my discipline, it's only a matter, and we've all experienced this, where if it's purely about the shell and the inside is dead, there's no inspiration, there's no love drive. Because listen, love is a driver in Islam. Love is the driver. Love of Allah, love of His messenger, that's the driver. They describe that as like the bird, the head of the bird. That's what drives. That's the direction. You are going in a direction based on love of Allah. Okay? And it's the wings of fear and hope that keep you balanced in flight. But without that love, what direction do you have? You just have arguments, you have disputation, you have legal theory, and more than likely you're not even living that legal theory. You're not even living those legal rulings. It's just ones and zeros in your mind. It's just code and knowledge. You might be breaking that same law that you're arguing and debating with. So here he's saying this is what manifests in this group. What manifested in them, as he says here, their natures were dry and their hearts were devoid of the fragrances of love for Allah. And this is a concern that was shared by the great Imams of Suluk, the spiritual sciences. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, in his al-Ghunya, he has an entire chapter on tasawwuf. He taught that the seeker should accompany both the jurists to learn the rulings of the religion and the ulama billah, those who have experiential knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to learn the path of spiritual refinement. Fiqh and suluk, spiritual wayfaring, in other words, are meant to complement one another. They have to go together. And this is exactly the balance that Imam Wāsiṭī was looking for. You remember, he leaves Wāsiṭ, a place, even though we would say it's all crooked, the whole thing is crooked. The aim, though, is spiritual experience. Without everything else, he's like, I got to get out of this because we got to find this balance. We got to marry these two things together. We need spiritual experience that's moderated by legal code. But he finds himself in an environment where the legal code is flourishing. They have a mastery of the law. I mean, when you look, if you look here in this work that we're talking about, this page we're talking about, the second paragraph, he starts to name all of the curriculum. This is all the works at Tanbih, al-Muhadhab, al-Wajiz, al-Wāsiṭ, Sharh al-Wajiz, al-Hāwī. These are all the books of their curriculum. So that basically means like Imam Wāsiṭī found himself in an environment that was fully developed. It wasn't like a one-off thing here. It's like a strange hodgepodge of books and resources, and like, I don't know what I'm learning a little bit of this, and then we're going over here and we're experimenting over here with that, and we're doing some. No, it was like this is a full-blown, thought-out, masterly crafted curriculum. It's a system. There's a identifiable leader. Imam al-Razi is the intellectual like captain of the ship. And everything is just kind of like moving in sync. Everything's moving in sync. It's a very kind of streamlined environment. However, his concern very quickly became spiritual cultivation within that community. And then he notes something. There's an absence there with it. Also the disconnect between the spiritual development, but the disconnect between the Prophet ﷺ's tradition and his companions. You note that he mentioned that. He said they lacked an-nur al-Muhammadi. And so there's one thing about, and here we should understand he's not trashing the madhab. He's not trashing the madhahib. Obviously he's a person of madhab. He went and he studied with the Shāfiʿī and he said, look, I benefited tremendous from them. I learned halal and haram. He goes and he moves on and he learns the Hanbali madhab later. He's not trashing madhahib. We should never understand that from Imam Wāsiṭī here. When he says they lacked this Muhammadan light, it doesn't mean you learn a madhab and now you don't have the opportunity to connect to the Prophet ﷺ, because at the core of the madhabs, it is all in service of understanding the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. It's just whether or not that particular scholarly milieu or that class is going to make those connections. Or are they going to stop and then they're going to leave it at that? And that's what he's describing. They would read a little bit, they'd get to the point, their answer is there, they'd stop, they wouldn't go any further tracing back, well, why, and what did the Prophet say, what did his companions, etc., etc. They'd stop there. So they lost a link between the legal code and ash-shari', the Prophet ﷺ. And so in doing that, this tremendous connection is lost. This tremendous connection. This connection with the Prophet ﷺ is what shapes your worldview. Your worldview is shaped by knowing and loving the Prophet ﷺ. Not only the rulings, but also the personality, the character, the family, the stories, the miracles, the special qualities. All of that is what ends up shaping your worldview. And if you are absorbed in that enough, then eventually, as he's describing, you'll be able to identify its opposite. It won't just be this is one ruling, that's maybe another ruling. Like like an attitude, a nonchalant attitude about things. Oh, they're doing this way and they're doing that way, But when you can identify this light of the Prophet ﷺ is when you can see the darkness. When you can see light, then you can identify what darkness is. If you can't see that light of the Prophet, you don't know what darkness is. And so that's why he says, look, these people, some of them, they would go back and mingle with the people of Wāsiṭ, and they would just carry on with them like no big deal because they were lacking that light, so they couldn't see the darkness that resided in that particular community. That's the absence of the prophetic light that he describes. Then in the Rihla here, he talks about, for the first time, and we're not that far, of course. We did spend a lot of time like just hovering over Wāsiṭ and that community. But here he mentions for the first time an identifiable school of theology. So we're talking about al-fiqh, and now we're talking about al-mutakallimun. Right? This is a school of theology that was prevalent there in that community. And he says they possessed no knowledge of the principles of belief as transmitted by the companions in the early generations. And then he mentions some of the great Imams, Sufyan al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Hamad ibn Zayd, Hamad ibn Salama, Ibn Mubarak, Ahmad, Imam Ahmad, Ishaq, and others. So those are all names you'd be familiar with. If you're into Hanbali Aqidah, then you'll know like those names are cited all the time, because that particular doctrine is based on those early generation and their transmissions. But here, this particular approach, it's not reliant upon that more than it is reliant upon the frameworks of Imam al-Ash'ari, Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, and those that came after. They begin to build frameworks of in order to defend the religion from the deviancy. And that's basically where the school of Kalām, from that it was born, right? In order to defend Islam. And that's the story of Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, basically. In a nutshell, you'll find that he rose to the challenge of defending Islam and was very successful in doing so. And he was acknowledged and praised for his ability because he studied from his initial doctrinal school was one of deviancy. And so he was very familiar with that. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened his heart and guided him. And so he took all of their teachings and went and reverse engineered all of that. And then came out in public and just obliterated it all. Right? And that's why you find the Hanabila that don't engage with this particular, or they were very reserved from Kalām. Like Ibn Qudama was vehemently opposed to Kalām. It doesn't mean he didn't employ it from time to time in his writings, but he was opposed to the nature of what it was. But among the Hanabila, it's noted by Ibn Asakir, he says, historically, whenever the Hanbalis, they wanted to refute deviancy, they would use the works of al-Ash'ariyya to do so. They would go and find in those works how to now refute opposition to Sunnism. Because that's what, a lot of what they did was built up all these defenses in order to push back, like philosophies, and even today it still works, like atheism, etc., all those types of things that show up. Those are the frameworks that are already developed and are essentially just waiting to be deployed. So while historically, even Imam Wāsiṭī here is kind of showing some restraint while he's saying, this is almost like a critique. They didn't have the early Imams as references for their Aqidah, but it was about Kalām. It's obviously a critique. And we have to put Imam Wāsiṭī in his place in terms of historical, because he dies 711, so he's still in the middle era where this type of precaution among the Hanbali scholars is being exercised. This is kind of a predominant, I wouldn't say overwhelming, I wouldn't say at all overwhelming position, but it is one that is still obviously in circulation. Anyway, that's definitely a topic for another time to get into the details of that. Interesting developments that happen there. I think the high value points that we can take away from this, from the observations of Imam Wāsiṭī, is to go back to his book called Mizan al-Shuyukh, which is basically known as the measure of spiritual masters, or shuyukh, like the leaders and the teachers. So he authored a book called Mizan al-Shuyukh. We've already looked at it a little bit prior to this. He says, and this is reflecting on the dangers that can corrupt scholarship. He says, as for the scholars, when they become consumed with love of the world, now think about these qualities. Just keep these in mind. Love of the world, the pursuit of wealth, competition for status and positions of authority, and the desire to gain favor with rulers by accommodating their passions and flattering them with their opinions. Their hearts, too, become darkened and blinded to right guidance, meaning the scholars. Their desires begin to shape their scholarship, corrupting what would otherwise be sound religious knowledge. Though the truth may still be present in what they teach, it becomes mixed with personal ambition and self-interest. As a result, they denounce wrongdoing only when it serves their worldly interest, using the banner of defending the religion to discredit those who oppose them. Likewise, they promote what is good only when it brings them influence, prestige, or leadership. Thus, the truth is neglected because of their own ambitions, and falsehood is allowed to flourish in order to preserve their own positions. In doing so, they distance themselves from Allah and lead others astray from Him and away from Him as well. Their missteps become like a sinking ship, dragging both themselves and others down with it. He makes an exception, except for a small remnant among them, obscure, oppressed, and often disliked. And how few are they? Most of them are in jail. Then he divides the scholars into three categories. Shuyukh, he has multiple, right? You have Shaykh al-Ilm, which is the al-Faqih, and you have Shaykh al-Arifin. He's the Shaykh Suluk, al-Sufi, Shaykh al-Sufi. Then you have Shaykh al-Fuqara, or he calls Shaykh al-Amma, and this is Shaykh al-Fuqara, like the masses. So the scholars, they fall into three categories. This is Shaykh al-Ilm. First is the one who knows Allah and knows his religion. This is the complete scholar, whose knowledge and spiritual state nourish every believer, Muslim, and sincere seeker. The finest examples of this are Abu Bakr, Umar, and the rest of the 10 promised paradise, radiyallahu anhum ajma'in, and the scholars and jurists among the companions. They united sacred knowledge, faithful practice, and divinely bestowed ma'rifah. They embodied every virtue of knowledge, righteous action, noble character, and spiritual excellence. They were the deepest in knowledge and soundest in practice and the most complete in their spiritual states. The second is the one who knows Allah's commands but does not truly know Allah. These are the jurists. They know what Allah has commanded and forbidden, yet their hearts have not become deeply attached to Him through complete love and genuine detachment from worldly ambition and positions of authority. The third is the one who knows Allah but does not know His commands. These are the unlettered Gnostics, al-Arifun. Their hearts possess a share of intimate knowledge of Allah, yet they do not know the detailed rulings of what He has commanded and prohibited. Right, so these are the categories, and he writes extensively about these categories, etc. in his work. Maybe we'll read it together, inshallah, when we have time. So the classification here of these three summarize his journey, essentially. Again, he wrote this at the end of his life, so a life of reflection and thought. He can say, what did I see? What do I identify? Let's break this down. What does it look like? So essentially, he's exposed to these different types, and he can see where the gaps are. The complete scholar, he says, is one who is united or brought together sufficient knowledge as well as spiritual cultivation. And he mentions an example of this. He points to Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, rahimahullah ta'ala. He says, the jurist would receive from him an increase in knowledge. So a faqih would go to Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and learn fiqh. And the Gnostic would receive from him an increase in gnosis. Al-Arif would go to him and would receive increase in that ma'rifah. These are complete scholars. This type, they consider min awliya illah. وله كرامات, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. And then he concludes and he says, describes the marks of a true teacher. So now that we've seen like what are the qualities of corruption in a scholar or a shaykh, and then we've seen the categories and the examples of that, now he gets to the qualities. He says the mark of a sound scholar in our time is that he possesses a deep knowledge of the Book of Allah, a thorough understanding of the Sunnah of his Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and mastery of the sacred law, meaning the rulings. He's able to trace new and emerging issues back to their foundational principles, supporting his judgments with evidence from the Qur'an and Sunnah whenever he is asked about difficult cases. At the same time, he acts upon the knowledge he possesses, so that nothing in his words or conduct contradicts what he knows to be true. He's committed to enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong, never neglecting the duty when he has the ability to fulfill it. He remains detached from positions of authority and excesses of worldly life. He remains detached from positions of authority and excesses of worldly life. This is Ibn al-Jawzi noting that he has this view that why did the Hanbali madhab not spread like the others? Because most of them, when they started to learn, when they learned just enough, they sought refuge and just went to worship. And they refused positions of authority and teaching. That's how that's how they spread, is you get appointed in a position as a judge. So now you're ruling a land by a particular Hanafi madhab, whatever, so it spreads. Or they get all these teaching positions. Right? Ibn al-Jawzi's view was that, look, the Hanabila in general, they would refuse to take positions. And so this is one of the reasons that it didn't catch on as much as the other madhab did. So here we're seeing some of that spirit being reflected in his definition of what a shaykh looks like, or the qualities of him, detached from these positions. Finally, he's among the people of hadith and the sunnah, avoiding kalam, logic, and those devoted to them. His creed is that of the people of hadith and transmitted tradition, ahl al-athar, ahl al-hadith wal-athar, or ahl al-hadith wal-athar, not the creed of the theologians and those who follow unsound opinions. So this is just some brief citations from his Mizan al-Shuyukh, after looking at his rihla and then reading through this, the connections are very clear. You can see that while the rihla is documenting his personal journey, this Mizan al-Shuyukh is kind of codifying archetypes, if you will. We're not talking about the shaykh in this place and the shaykh in that place, or we're not talking about names. He's talking about now what the category looks like. And it's quite obvious from the reading that not only is this a study for him, and this is what is very powerful about Imam Wāsiṭī's writings, is not only is this a study in theory. I mean, you could read through, for example, al-Ghunya, I've already identified, Shaykh Abdul Qadir's al-Ghunya. You could read through that, and you could develop categories, and you could put together protocols and things, and then you could say, look, this is, in theory, this is what it looks like. But Imam Wāsiṭī is not just the theory, it's the lived experience. So not only does he have understanding of the theory of the thing, but he knows what it looks like when it goes wrong and when it goes right. And then he knows what it looks like when it's kind of a mix between the two. Right? Having lived around the Muslim world in various different environments, because some great imams, they didn't experience that. They were there in one environment. It was a supportive environment. It was a protective environment. And so they're coming from that place of, like, it's all good, man. You know, man?
Yep, man.
But someone that has lived in the darkness, they're going to bring a perspective that a person that's only lived in the light will never understand. And so that's why his counsel in some of these works is very profound, because he's showing us what the darkness looks like for those of us that have been blessed not to live in it. That's all the time we have for this evening. Jazakallah khair wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.